Their eyes were filled with fear. Their hearts carried darkness. They had heard the rumors that American prisons were nothing but gates to death. They believed torture was waiting. They imagined hunger, pain, and no chance of survival. But when the prison doors finally opened, what they saw changed everything. Clean beds, soft blankets, hot showers, the smell of breakfast drifting through the air. One German woman whispered softly, "Is this really prison?" And in that moment, they all realized this was nothing like the nightmare they expected. The year was 1944. The war had consumed Europe, and for many German women, the battlefield was not just far away. It had suddenly arrived at their doorstep. Some served as nurses, some worked in offices. Others were simply caught in the chaos as entire cities collapsed under Allied advance. But when the dust settled, thousands of them found themselves in a place they had never imagined: prisoners of war. From the moment they were captured, fear followed them like a shadow. For years, Nazi propaganda had whispered the same terrifying message: if the Americans catch you, you will suffer. They will treat you like animals. You will never return alive. These women carried those words deep inside their hearts. On the long journey across the Atlantic, whispers filled the night air. "What will they do to us?" one asked. "Will they starve us?" another said. A third, with tears running from her face, muttered, "Maybe they will execute us the moment we arrive." The ship rocked with every wave, but the storm in their minds was far stronger. Every clang of metal, every shout from the guards above made them flinch. They clung to their memories of home, families, children, friends, wondering if they would ever see them again. For days, the ocean swallowed their fears. They were silent, but their eyes told the story of women who expected nothing but misery. And yet, unknown to them, their journey was leading not to torture, but to something that would challenge everything they had been taught, something so different, so unexpected, that they would question if they were even prisoners at all. The gates of America were waiting, but what waited behind those gates would shake them to the core. The ship finally slowed. After weeks of silence and fear, the women felt the motion change. The endless ocean gave way to a distant horizon. And then, land. For many of them, it was the first glimpse of America, the country they had been told was cruel, ruthless, and unforgiving. As they stepped onto the dock, their hearts pounded. Guards stood tall in crisp uniforms. Trucks waited to take them away. The air smelled of oil, salt, and something they could not place: freedom, perhaps. The women kept their heads low. Some whispered prayers. Others clutched their hands tightly, bracing for what would come next. Would they be dragged to dark cells? Would they be humiliated, beaten, or worse? The trucks rumbled forward, carrying them deeper into the unknown. Fields stretched wide on both sides. Instead of ruins and rubble, there were farms, houses, and children playing by the road. Some American civilians even stopped to watch the convoy pass. Their eyes were curious, but not filled with hatred.
Hours later, the gates of the camp appeared. Tall fences, guard towers, and barbed wire confirmed their worst fear. Yes, this was prison. The trucks stopped. The women stepped down, one by one. Boots on gravel, chains of fear rattling in their hearts. And then, something happened. Something none of them were prepared for. The gates opened, but behind them was not darkness. Instead, the camp looked almost like a village. Wooden barracks lined up neatly. The ground was clean. Paths were swept. There were trees, flowers, even a garden in sight. The guards spoke calmly, not with shouts or blows. "Line up. Follow us." Their voices carried authority, but not cruelty. Inside the barracks, the women froze. Before them were rows of clean beds, sheets folded tightly, pillows soft and waiting, blankets that smelled of soap, not rot. One woman touched the fabric with trembling hands. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Finally, she whispered, almost in disbelief, "This cannot be real. This cannot be prison." And then came the greatest shock of all. A soldier pointed to a building nearby. Showers, soap, towels. Hot water spilled down as they stepped inside. For the first time in months, perhaps years, they washed away the dirt of war. The steam filled the air, but it was their tears that mixed with the water. Some cried silently. Others laughed nervously, as if afraid it might all vanish. By the time evening fell, the smell of food spread through the camp. The women followed the guards into the dining hall. Plates waited for them. Bread, meat, vegetables, and even coffee. The kind of meal many had not seen since before the war. Forks clinked. Eyes widened. And then, slowly, cautiously, they began to eat. One of them looked around, her voice barely louder than a breath. "Is this really prison?" The question hung in the air. None of them had the courage to answer, because the truth was stranger than any rumor they had ever heard. This was not the prison they feared. It was something else, something they could not yet understand.
The first morning in the camp felt like a dream they were afraid to wake from. Sunlight slipped through the small windows of the barracks, and for a moment, some of the women thought they were home again. But then they remembered the fences, the towers, and the guards outside. Fear returned until the smell of food reached them. It was breakfast. Warm bread, butter, bacon sizzling in pans, and even fresh fruit. They were led into the dining hall, rows of long wooden tables waiting. Trays were placed in front of them, filled with food that seemed impossible for prisoners. Coffee steamed in mugs. Eggs glistened on plates. It was more than some of them had eaten in weeks. At first, no one moved. One woman whispered, "It must be poisoned." Another shook her head. "They're mocking us." The guards did not shout. They did not force. They simply stood nearby, watching in silence. Finally, one of the prisoners lifted a spoon and took a bite. Nothing happened. Then another ate, and another. Soon the silence broke with the sound of cautious chewing, then sighs of relief. A smile appeared, then another. For the first time since their capture, they felt a strange, forbidden comfort. Days began to settle into a rhythm. Morning roll calls, meals on time, and work assignments. Some were sent to kitchens, others to gardens, some to sewing rooms. To their shock, they even received wages for their labor. Tiny amounts, but enough to buy soap, chocolate, or postcards at the camp canteen. The idea of being paid as prisoners was so absurd that many laughed in disbelief, but the coins in their hands were real. Then came another surprise. They were given paper and envelopes. They could write to their families. For a moment, the barracks were filled with silence as the women stared at the blank sheets. One by one, they began to write. Tears fell on the pages as pens scratched across the paper. "I am alive. I am safe. I am treated well." Words they never thought they would send home again. The camp also had a library. Rows of books, some in English, and even shelves in German. Novels, poetry, dictionaries, knowledge that had been denied to them in the chaos of war. Some women read late into the night, whispering lines of poetry to themselves, finding escape in stories far from the battlefield. Evenings brought music. An American guard carried in a gramophone, and soon the strange, fast rhythms of jazz filled the air. At first, the women listened stiffly, unsure whether to laugh or cover their ears. But soon, feet tapped softly under the tables, fingers drummed against knees, and nervous giggles escaped. Later, the women were allowed to sing themselves. German folk songs rose into the air, voices trembling at first, then strong. For a moment, the camp no longer felt like a prison, but like a village lost in time.
And yet, the question never left their minds. Is this really prison? They looked at the fences, the guards, the watchtowers. They remembered the warnings of execution, starvation, and cruelty. None of it had happened. Instead, they had food, beds, books, even moments of laughter. Every day, the fear that had once consumed them was replaced by something even stranger: gratitude. But the shadows of war still reached them. Newspapers carried news of Germany's cities destroyed, families displaced, children left without homes. At night, the women whispered in their bunks, "What has happened to our homes? Are our children safe? Will anyone be waiting when we return?" The camp gave them comfort, but it could not erase the weight of war pressing down on their hearts. The days passed. The women adjusted. Some even began to feel safe. But then came the day that changed everything, when the camp prepared for a celebration so unexpected, so unthinkable, that the prisoners themselves began to beg for something they never imagined before. Snow fell, gently outside the wire fences, covering the camp in a quiet white blanket. Inside, something unusual was happening. The guards moved with strange energy, carrying boxes and decorations into the hall. The smell of pine drifted through the air, mixed with the sweet scent of baked goods. The women exchanged puzzled glances. What could this mean? It was Christmas. The prisoners had expected nothing more than another cold, ordinary day, but when they entered the dining hall, they froze in disbelief. Tables were covered with white cloths. Candles flickered in the dim light. On each plate sat a small gift: an orange, a piece of chocolate, or a warm scarf knitted by women from the nearby town. There was music, too. Soft carols played on a piano. For many of the German women, it was the first time in years they had seen such abundance. Some wept openly. One prisoner whispered, "This feels like home, but we are the enemy." Another shook her head, unable to speak. The guards, instead of standing sternly at the corners, joined them at the tables. Together, they shared food, laughter, and silence. For one night, the war outside seemed to vanish. Then came something even stranger. A priest was brought into the camp. He held a small Christmas service, speaking softly of peace, forgiveness, and the hope that one day all suffering would end. Many of the women bowed their heads. Others simply closed their eyes, listening to the words that touched a wound they had carried for too long. But this was not the only celebration. Months later came Thanksgiving. Once again, the women were shocked. A giant roasted turkey, vegetables, pies filled with apples and pumpkins, meals that even many American families were struggling to enjoy back home, were served here, inside the prison. The women ate slowly, savoring each bite, unable to believe such generosity. And then, the Americans did something the women never forgot. They invited the prisoners to decorate the hall themselves. Colored paper chains were made by hand, lanterns cut from old newspapers, and songs chosen by the women.
For the first time, the camp echoed with both German and American voices singing together. The sound rose into the cold night air, floating beyond the fences. But in the middle of this strange joy, the questions grew heavier. How could this be war? How could this be prison? Many of the women began to feel torn between gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for the kindness they were shown, guilt for knowing that while they were safe, their families in Germany were suffering hunger, bombings, and despair. At night, some lay awake, staring at the ceiling. They whispered prayers for their children. They clutched photos close to their chests. A few even confessed to each other, "I do not want to leave. At least here I know I am alive." Still, beneath the warmth and celebration, there was something unspoken, something that made the women uneasy. The guards smiled, yes. The food was plentiful, yes. But the barbed wire never disappeared, the watchtowers never emptied, and the gates never opened. The women lived in comfort, but they were not free. That unshakable truth began to creep back into their thoughts, until the day the war ended. The morning the news arrived, the camp was unusually quiet. Guards moved about quickly, whispering to one another. Papers were folded tightly under their arms, faces tense, but no one explained. The women sensed it. Something had changed. By noon, the commandant gathered them in the yard. His voice carried across the rows of prisoners. "The war is over." The words struck like lightning. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Some women gasped, others covered their mouths, and a few broke down in tears. The war that had stolen their lives, their homes, their futures, it was finally over. But what did this mean for them? Freedom or something else? Soon, the camp's gates were no longer the walls of fear they once seemed. Instead, they became a terrifying mystery. The women wondered, when we step through those gates, what waits for us? The Americans prepared to release them, but freedom suddenly felt cruel. For months, the camp had given them food, safety, warmth, even moments of joy. Outside, all they imagined was ruins, hunger, and loneliness. One woman whispered, "Here we had beds. Out there we may have nothing." Another clutched her scarf tighter and asked, "What if my family is gone?" In those final days, the women moved slowly, memorizing every corner of the camp. The gardens where they worked, the hall where they ate, the barracks where they whispered secrets at night. Even the guards, once symbols of fear, now seemed like distant protectors. A strange bond had formed, unwanted, impossible, but real. Then came the morning of departure. Trucks lined up outside the gates. The women climbed aboard with their small belongings. As the engines rumbled to life, some wept silently, others stared into the distance. A few dared to wave goodbye to the guards, unsure if they would wave back. Some did. As the trucks rolled away, the women looked back one last time. The fences, the towers, the barbed wire, all the things they once cursed, now blurred with tears. Behind those walls, they had found safety in the unlikeliest place. Ahead of them, only uncertainty. And that question, the one that had haunted them from the first day to the last, remained in their hearts. Was this really prison, or was it something we will never understand again? Some of the women tried to return home after their release, but home was no longer the place they remembered. Villages were in ashes, families were scattered. Many of their houses had been taken by others, and the streets they once knew were unrecognizable. A few searched desperately for husbands, fathers, or brothers who had gone to war. Most found nothing, only graves, or names on long lists of the dead. Others returned to silence, realizing that no one was waiting for them at all. One woman wrote in her diary, "In the camp, I was a prisoner. Outside, I am free, but more lost than ever." For her, the walls of the camp had been strange protection. Beyond those walls, survival became harder. Some women never spoke about their time in the American camps. They feared judgment, feared being seen as traitors if they admitted the truth that life inside was more humane than anything they found outside. Yet deep inside, many carried secret gratitude. Gratitude for the hot meals, the kindness of strangers, the small acts that reminded them they were still human. Decades later, when they were old and gray, a few told their grandchildren the same words they once whispered in disbelief. Is this really prison? Or was it something we will never understand again? And with those words, the memory of an impossible chapter of history lived on, where enemies were treated with dignity, and where the meaning of freedom was not as simple as walking through a gate.